Right now, the world pumps about 102 million barrels of oil a day, over 4 billion gallons, into cars, homes, and factories across the globe. And if you ask most people where this black liquid comes from, they'll confidently tell you it's liquefied dinosaur remains. It seems logical, dinosaurs, fossils, fossil fuels, but the reality is far stranger. Not one drop of the oil in your tank owes its origin to dinosaurs, which appeared long after petroleum deposits formed. The real source is far more surprising and reveals one of the most successful marketing myths in history: the billion-dollar marketing deception. This deception has a name, a face, and a corporate boardroom where it was born. Walk into any elementary school classroom, and you'll find picture books showing cartoon dinosaurs standing next to oil derricks with captions explaining how these ancient reptiles became the gasoline in our cars. Turn on the Discovery Channel and watch documentaries that casually mention dinosaur oil while showing computer animations of T-Rex skeletons dissolving into black crude. Visit gas stations across America and notice the dinosaur mascots grinning from corporate logos, reinforcing the connection between prehistoric giants and petroleum products. But this isn't some innocent misconception that evolved naturally over time. The dinosaur oil myth represents one of the most successful corporate propaganda campaigns in modern history, a deliberate deception that rewrote scientific understanding in the public mind and continues to influence how billions of people think about energy. What makes this particularly shocking is that unlike folklore or urban legends that develop organically through generations of storytelling, this myth has a precise birth date and a corporate architect who orchestrated its global spread. The mastermind behind this deception was the Sinclair Oil Corporation, founded in 1916 by Harry Sinclair. In the early 1930s, Sinclair's marketing department faced a challenge that many oil companies struggled with: how to make petroleum products memorable and appealing to average consumers who had little understanding of geology or chemistry. The solution they devised would prove so effective that it would override decades of scientific education and embed itself permanently in popular consciousness. Sinclair's marketing team made a calculated decision to link their brand with dinosaurs, not because of any scientific accuracy, but because dinosaurs captured the public imagination in a way that microscopic marine organisms never could. The campaign launched with Sinclair's adoption of a green brontosaurus as their corporate mascot in 1930, which they trademarked in 1932, complete with a slogan that positioned their oil as coming from these magnificent prehistoric creatures. This wasn't accidental imagery or a casual association. It was a meticulously planned strategy to create a simple, memorable story that would stick in consumers' minds. The genius of this marketing approach lay in its exploitation of a linguistic coincidence that even scientists had inadvertently created. The term fossil fuels already existed in scientific literature, referring to any fuel derived from ancient organic matter. In fact, fossil in fossil fuel simply means dug up in Latin, not prehistoric reptiles. But Sinclair's marketers recognized that most people didn't understand this technical definition. They simply associated the word with dinosaur bones they'd seen in museums. By connecting these dots for consumers, Sinclair created a narrative that felt logical and scientific while being completely false. What transformed this single company's marketing campaign into a global myth was its amplification through two massive cultural phenomena. The first was the 1933 to 1934 Century of Progress World's Fair in Chicago, where Sinclair constructed an elaborate dinosaur exhibit that drew millions of visitors from around the world. Families walked through detailed dinosaur dioramas, while Sinclair representatives explained how these creatures had transformed into the oil that powered modern civilization. The second amplifying event came at the 1964-1965 New York World's Fair, where Sinclair outdid their previous effort with an even more sophisticated dinosaur display featuring advanced animatronics and theatrical presentations called Dinoland. By this point, the association between dinosaurs and oil had become so entrenched that other companies began adopting similar imagery, creating a feedback loop that reinforced the myth across the entire petroleum industry. The campaign's success exceeded even Sinclair's wildest expectations. Within decades, The dinosaur oil connection had infiltrated educational materials, children's books, television programs, and casual conversation. Teachers who had learned the myth as children passed it on to new generations of students. Science textbooks began including simplified explanations that reinforced the misconception rather than correcting it. Popular media embraced the narrative because it provided an easy way to explain complex geological processes to general audiences. What makes this deception particularly insidious is how it exploited people's natural tendency to accept information that comes from authoritative sources. When a major corporation with oil expertise promoted the dinosaur connection, and when this message appeared at prestigious international exhibitions alongside legitimate scientific displays, most people had no reason to question its accuracy. The myth gained credibility through repetition and institutional endorsement rather than scientific evidence. The dinosaur imagery became so powerful that it transcended Sinclair's original marketing purposes and embedded itself in the broader cultural understanding of energy and geology. Gas stations across the country adopted dinosaur mascots and promotional materials. Educational publishers included dinosaur oil connections in science curricula. Even scientists found themselves having to work against this entrenched misconception when teaching about petroleum formation. By the 1970s, the myth had achieved something unprecedented in marketing history. It had completely overwritten scientific fact in public consciousness. Polls conducted during this period showed that an overwhelming majority of Americans believed oil came from dinosaurs, despite the fact that no geology textbook or scientific paper had ever supported this claim. The marketing campaign had become more influential than actual scientific education. Today, nearly a century after Sinclair launched their dinosaur campaign, the myth continues to influence how people think about energy, despite overwhelming scientific evidence to the contrary. Modern oil companies have largely moved away from dinosaur imagery, but the association remains so strong that correcting it requires active effort. Science educators report that debunking the dinosaur oil myth is one of their most challenging tasks because students arrive in classrooms with decades of cultural reinforcement supporting the misconception. The persistence of this myth demonstrates how a single corporation's marketing strategy can have consequences that extend far beyond their original commercial goals. When companies shape public understanding of scientific concepts for profit rather than accuracy, they create distortions that can last for generations. But understanding how this deception took hold only makes the real story of oil's origins more remarkable by comparison. What actually died to fill your gas tank? The creatures responsible for every gallon in your gas tank lived in a world completely alien to anything dinosaurs ever experienced. While you've been imagining massive reptiles melting into petroleum, the real creators were organisms so tiny they exist in a realm invisible to the naked eye. These microscopic marine creatures lived in numbers that make dinosaur populations look insignificant, and their deaths created biological events that dwarf any extinction in Earth's history. Picture ancient oceans stretching across vast continents, their surfaces shimmering under primordial sunlight. The most important life forms weren't large creatures swimming through these waters, but microscopic plants called phytoplankton, single-celled algae no bigger than the period at the end of the sentence, and tiny animals called zooplankton that drifted through the water column like living dust. These organisms existed in concentrations so dense that the water itself took on different colors when viewed from above. Diatoms, a particular type of algae with intricate glass-like shells, populated these ancient seas in numbers that challenge human comprehension. A single drop of seawater could contain thousands of these organisms, and they reproduced at rates that allowed their populations to explode across entire ocean basins within weeks. Unlike dinosaurs, which required years to reach maturity and produced relatively few offspring, these microscopic creatures could double their populations daily under optimal conditions. The abundance comparison between these marine microorganisms and dinosaurs reveals the absurdity of the petroleum myth. Researchers estimate that plankton biomass dwarfs dinosaur biomass by enormous margins, which explains why oil volumes demand far more microorganisms than land animals could ever provide. Paleontologists calculate that all dinosaur species combined over their entire 165 million year reign produced perhaps a few billion tons of total biomass. Meanwhile, the phytoplankton and zooplankton in just a single ancient ocean could generate more biomass in a single year than all dinosaurs produced in a millennium. When these tiny creatures died, they didn't perish individually like large animals. When algae blooms collapsed, trillions of cells sank and built vast organic layers underwater. Seasonal changes, volcanic eruptions, climate shifts, or simple nutrient depletion could trigger die-offs involving trillions of organisms simultaneously. These death events occurred on scales that make the asteroid impact that killed the dinosaurs seem modest by comparison. The mystery of how something so impossibly small could create something so valuable lies in the unique properties of marine microorganisms. Unlike dinosaurs, which were composed largely of bones, muscles, and other structures that decompose rapidly, these microscopic creatures contained high concentrations of lipids, proteins, and hydrocarbons that could survive the initial stages of decay. Their cellular structures were already rich in the carbon and hydrogen compounds that would eventually become petroleum. The conditions required for oil formation strongly favored these marine organisms over any land-dwelling dinosaurs. Oil creation demands environments with limited oxygen, rapid burial, and specific chemical conditions that existed almost exclusively in ancient ocean basins. Terrestrial dinosaurs lived and died in environments where oxygen-rich conditions promoted complete decomposition, breaking down organic matter into carbon dioxide and water rather than preserving it for petroleum formation. The timing of major oil deposits further proves the marine origin of petroleum. The most productive oil-forming periods in Earth's history occurred when vast shallow seas covered much of the planet's surface, creating ideal conditions for marine microorganism blooms and subsequent die-offs. These periods, including the Carboniferous and Permian eras, featured global ocean conditions that supported massive populations of algae and plankton while providing the anoxic seafloor environments necessary for organic matter preservation. Ancient bacteria played crucial roles in these underwater ecosystems, both as oil precursors themselves and as processors of other organic matter. When bacterial populations crashed along with algae and plankton, their cellular remains contributed additional hydrocarbons to the accumulating organic deposits. These bacterial contributions were particularly important because bacteria concentrate lipids and other petroleum precursors in their cell membranes and storage structures. The geographical distribution of oil deposits confirms this marine origin story. Major petroleum reserves consistently occur in areas that were once covered by ancient seas, particularly in regions where oceanic conditions favored high biological productivity. The sedimentary rocks that contain oil formed from accumulated marine sediments and their geological signatures clearly indicate underwater deposition environments incompatible with dinosaur habitats. Modern oil exploration techniques can identify the specific types of organic matter that form different petroleum deposits, and these analyses consistently point to marine microorganisms as the primary source. Geochemical fingerprinting of crude oil reveals molecular structures that could only have originated from algae, plankton, and bacteria, rather than from complex multicellular organisms like dinosaurs. The transformation process that converted these microscopic organisms into petroleum required precise environmental conditions that occurred naturally in ancient marine settings. The organic-rich mud created by dead microorganisms needed rapid burial by additional sediments to prevent complete decomposition. This burial process happened routinely in ancient ocean basins where sediment from rivers and atmospheric dust continuously accumulated over biological deposits. The incredible efficiency of marine microorganisms in creating petroleum becomes apparent when you consider that organisms measuring just micrometers in size generated enough organic matter to power industrial civilization for over a century. Every time you fill your gas tank, You're essentially harvesting the accumulated remains of countless microscopic creatures that lived and died in ancient seas millions of years before the first dinosaur ever walked the earth. Understanding that every drop of oil originated from creatures so small you'd need a microscope to see them completely reframes our relationship with petroleum and reveals just how disconnected the dinosaur myth really is from scientific reality. But knowing what died to create oil is only half the story. The real mystery begins with what happened to these microscopic corpses after they started their long journey toward the ocean floor. The underwater burial grounds. Picture ancient ocean waters turning dark as billions upon billions of microscopic corpses begin their final descent toward the seafloor. These weren't isolated deaths scattered across time, but massive mortality events that transformed entire ocean basins into underwater cemeteries. When algae blooms crashed or zooplankton populations collapsed, the dying organisms created biological snowstorms that could last for months. With microscopic bodies falling through hundreds of meters of water column before settling into thick organic-rich layers on the bottom. The race against decomposition began the moment these organisms died. Bacterial decay worked furiously to break down the fallen microorganisms, and under normal circumstances, this process would completely destroy all organic matter within weeks or months. Aerobic bacteria, which require oxygen to survive, attack dead organisms aggressively and reduce them to basic compounds like carbon dioxide and water. But the sheer volume of dying organisms during these ancient mass mortality events created a critical problem for the bacteria. They consumed oxygen faster than the ocean could replenish it. As oxygen levels dropped in the water column, and especially near the seafloor, aerobic bacteria began suffocating and dying themselves. This created a narrow window of opportunity where organic matter could accumulate faster than bacteria could destroy it. The key factor determining whether organic matter would survive long enough to become oil was the speed of burial beneath subsequent sediment layers. These sediments needed to be buried in oxygen-free basins, like ancient inland seas, so bacteria couldn't fully decompose the organic matter. Ancient ocean basins provided ideal conditions for rapid burial because they functioned as massive sediment traps. Rivers carried enormous quantities of sand, silt, and clay into these marine environments, while atmospheric dust and volcanic ash added additional layers from above. The organic matter from dead microorganisms became sandwiched between these inorganic sediment layers, creating alternating bands of biological and mineral deposits. This layering process was essential because it isolated the organic matter from oxygen-rich water above and prevented bacterial decomposition from completing its destructive work. The formation of source rocks required very specific geological conditions that existed only in certain ancient environments. These rocks formed when organic-rich sediments accumulated in depressions on the ocean floor, where water circulation was limited and oxygen levels remained consistently low. Basins with restricted water flow, such as inland seas or deep ocean trenches, created perfect conditions for preserving organic matter because fresh oxygenated water couldn't easily reach the bottom to fuel bacterial activity. Shallow continental shelves during the Carboniferous and Permian periods, spanning from approximately 360 to 252 million years ago, provided some of the most productive environments for source rock formation. These periods, which occurred long before dinosaurs first appeared, created the vast majority of the world's oil deposits. The areas featured warm temperatures that supported massive populations of marine microorganisms, while their limited depth and restricted circulation created the anoxic bottom conditions necessary for organic preservation. The combination of high biological productivity in surface waters and oxygen-poor conditions on the seafloor made these environments incredibly efficient at converting living organisms into petroleum precursors. The thickness of sediment accumulation played a crucial role in determining whether organic matter would eventually transform into oil. Thin layers of organic-rich sediment often remain too close to the surface, where oxygen infiltration and bacterial activity could still destroy the preserved organic matter over geological time. Successful oil formation required sediment layers that eventually reached depths of several hundred meters to over a kilometer creating the pressure and temperature conditions necessary for petroleum generation. The burial process occurred gradually over millions of years, with each new layer of sediment adding weight and pressure to the organic matter below. As burial depth increased, the temperature also rose due to the Earth's natural geothermal gradient, which increases temperature by approximately 25 degrees Celsius for every kilometer of depth. This combination of mounting pressure and rising temperature would eventually trigger the chemical reactions that convert organic matter into petroleum, but only if the initial preservation in anoxic conditions had been successful. The concept of the oil window describes the precise depth and temperature range where organic matter transforms into petroleum. This narrow range typically occurs at depths between 1,500 and 4,000 meters below the surface, where temperatures range from 60 to 120 degrees Celsius. Above this window, temperatures remain too low for the complex chemical reactions required for oil formation. Below this window, excessive heat breaks down petroleum into natural gas or destroys it entirely. Source rocks that successfully generated oil share common characteristics that reflect their formation in these ancient underwater burial grounds. They contain high concentrations of organic carbon, typically between 1 and 10% by weight, and display chemical signatures that clearly indicate marine rather than terrestrial sources. The molecular structure of organic compounds preserved in these rocks can be traced directly to specific types of algae, bacteria, and zooplankton that lived in ancient oceans. The efficiency of these underwater burial grounds in preserving organic matter varied dramatically based on local environmental conditions. Areas with rapid sedimentation rates and strong anoxic conditions could preserve up to 10% of the organic matter that settled on the seafloor. In contrast, well-oxygenated environments with slow burial rates typically preserved less than 1% of organic input, making them unsuitable for petroleum formation despite having abundant marine life. Understanding the formation of these underwater burial grounds reveals why oil formation required such extraordinary circumstances. The process demanded a perfect storm of biological abundance, environmental conditions, and geological timing that occurred only in specific places during certain periods of Earth's history. The microscopic organisms that created our petroleum reserves had to die in massive numbers, settle in oxygen-free environments, become rapidly buried under thick sediment layers, and then remain undisturbed for millions of years while underground forces slowly began their work. But burial was only the beginning of an even more remarkable transformation that would unfold in the depths below. The three-stage underground transformation. Deep beneath the surface, pressure and temperature begin orchestrating a chemical transformation so precise it makes industrial refining look crude by comparison. This underground alchemy unfolds in two distinct stages, each demanding exact conditions that must align perfectly over millions of years. If any variable strays outside its narrow acceptable range, the entire process fails and the organic matter either decomposes completely or transforms into something entirely different. The first stage begins as burial depth increases beyond the initial 10 meters where bacterial decomposition occurred. Rising pressure and temperature from accumulating sediment layers stress and eventually kill the anaerobic bacteria that had been processing the organic matter. This marks a critical transition where biological processes give way to purely chemical reactions driven by the Earth's natural geothermal gradient and mounting pressure from overlying rock layers. The death of bacteria triggers the recombination of simple hydrocarbons they produced into larger, more complex molecules. These hydrocarbons begin linking together in long chains and ring structures, forming a solid, waxy substance called kerogen. Kerogen represents the intermediate stage between dead organic matter and petroleum, serving as the raw material that will eventually transform into oil under precisely the right conditions. Kerogen formation continues as burial depth increases toward 1 kilometer below the surface. During this prolonged stage, the organic matter undergoes gradual chemical restructuring as pressure and temperature slowly increase. The simple molecules left behind by bacterial decomposition link together in increasingly complex arrangements, creating a substance that looks and feels like brown or black wax when examined in rock samples. The chemical composition of kerogen varies significantly depending on the original organisms that formed it and the specific conditions during its formation. Kerogen, derived from marine algae and plankton, typically contains the right molecular structures for eventual oil formation, while kerogen from land plants tends to produce natural gas instead of liquid petroleum. This difference explains why most major oil deposits formed in ancient marine environments rather than terrestrial settings where dinosaurs lived and died. The second stage requires kerogen to enter what geologists call the oil window, a narrow temperature range between 60 and 120 degrees Celsius where the chemical transformation into petroleum can occur. Below this temperature range, kerogen remains stable and unchanged despite millions of years of burial. Above this range, excessive heat breaks down the molecular structures entirely, destroying any possibility of oil formation and converting the material into natural gas or eliminating it completely. The oil window typically occurs at burial depths between 1,500 and 4,000 meters below the surface, where the Earth's geothermal gradient provides exactly the right amount of heat to drive the kerogen to petroleum transformation. Within this temperature range, the long molecular chains in kerogen begin breaking apart and recombining into the shorter hydrocarbon molecules that characterize crude oil. This process, called Catagenesis, represents the actual birth of petroleum.